Good morning. I'm going to talk to you this morning about a program that I was instrumental in helping set up, but was able to do because of an extraordinary team of people that made long-term commitments to studying a particular problem in development, but also trying to instantiate a different way of doing that. That program is called Justice for the Poor. It sounds like an NGO, but it's actually based within the World Bank, based within the Justice Reform Practice Group within the World Bank's governance group, previously in the Legal Reform Vice Presidency. Justice for the Poor is about understanding justice issues from a user's perspective. What does justice look like when everyday people are trying to claim their rights or trying to resolve the disputes that they are part of? It's also about trying to understand the way in which justice systems engage with the challenges that development projects themselves introduce into people's lives. Development, by definition, changes people's lives. It can also change quite fundamentally how the rules of the game function in villages. And so our particular program was really interested in learning about how these rule systems were being changed as a result of direct engagement with development projects, whether those development projects were working wonderfully or perhaps not so wonderfully. We set up Justice for the Poor in Indonesia, and over the last 12 years, we've been able to run that out to about 20 different countries around the world, about a dozen at any given moment in time. We work in very large countries like Indonesia. We work in very small countries like the Solomon Islands, which I'm going to talk about today, largely because no one else is going to talk about the Solomon Islands. And I think it's actually a really interesting microcosm of a much broader phenomena in development, particularly as it pertains to the modernization of rule systems, the transformation of rule systems as they happen through the beginnings of becoming a citizen and encountering the machinery of the state and the machinery of the development industry. So we were able to enter into the Solomon Islands because of a crisis born of a civil war that had occurred in the early 2000s, in which several hundred people had died, and which was leading to a regional refugee crisis with people leaving and deep concerns that this was going to be an island of instability in the region. And so there was a large donor response set up to try and address that particular concern. What was the problem as far as donors were concerned? The problem was the absence of an effective judicial system, the absence of sufficient policemen, the absence of courts that could be able to deal with perpetrators of crimes. And so on that basis, an elaborate response was mounted by the international community to try and provide those kinds of resources that they deemed necessary to solve the problem that they themselves had articulated. And so if you go to the web, for example, you can see an extraordinary photo of a beautiful looking courthouse constructed in Malayata, the second island of the Solomon Islands. Environmentally friendly, locally sourced with materials, using local labor. Every box you could want to tick in terms of this being a wonderful building that was made. No problems with corruption, procured perfectly, situated just so that it could capture the breezes coming in off the ocean, so it has zero carbon footprint. A donor's dream, right? It looked fantastic, except that it only was able to be used twice in its first 3 years of operation, because that actually wasn't the kinds of disputes and problems that everyday Solomon Islanders themselves were actually encountering. And so Justice for the Poor entered this space in the aftermath of a recognition by the donor community that as much as it was okay in some sense to be able to present wonderful buildings, and just around the corner from that jail, there is also round from the courthouse, there's this beautiful jail. It also cost hundreds of millions of dollars. It has 8 people inside it when I was there on a mission a few years ago. So we have this really mismatch between what the donors were deeming to be the problem, or what even with elites within the country themselves were deeming to be the problem, and what the people themselves thought the actual problems were that they were confronting most of the time. Justice for the Poor was able to enter into that space with a medium-run commitment to try to be able to understand and document what it was that people themselves were actually encountering when they tried to use the prevailing justice system. And as a result of a long-term study, which is available on the web, called Justice Delivered Locally, we were able to find 4 things that characterized the prevailing types of disputes that poor people in the Solomon Islands faced. They faced problems with alcoholism and drugs and beer, basically. Lots of dysfunctionality emerging into communities because of the cheap availability of non-local sources of alcohol. The second series of problems pertain to land. This is a ubiquitous issue in developing countries, but especially important in a country like the Solomon Islands, where land is so crucial to people's identities and to their livelihoods, but where it is also beautiful for tourism purposes and lucrative for logging purposes. And so huge disputes emerging over what that land actually was and who owned it and who had jurisdictional authority to be able to negotiate with tourism operators and loggers when contracts were being negotiated. That led quickly into a third series of problems pertaining to development projects themselves, which were entering into these communities and fundamentally changing things like gender norms, how men and women related to each other, fundamentally changing education levels. So by doing good things like raising levels of education, you are actually radically altering the divisions between young and old in society, because the older people couldn't read and write and thus were deemed to be fools by the rising generation. And the fourth set of problems pertained to family disputes, just everyday divisions between families over inheritance rights and domestic violence. Those four problems were the ones that most poor people were encountering most of the time. And our research was able to document that and then present it into a public forum where there was able to be a debate around what that might the solutions to those problems might look like. Our goal wasn't to provide the answer to that problem, it was to put into a public space our research conducted in 5 of the 9 provinces to try and document the nature and extent of that. And I think that's a key lesson that emerges from what we're able to do, is to use the convening power and the computing power of the World Bank, not its solution providing power, but its capacity to create a space for an indigenous political debate to occur around what the appropriate sets of solutions would be, which manifested itself then in a whole new program of lending set around what we call the island courts, which was about trying to take justice systems to the people rather than the people to the justice systems, which, as I explained before, were being used so infrequently and costing hundreds of millions of dollars to not be used. Just around the corner from the jail that I just described was the local police constable. He has 800 files stacked on the floor to the ceiling of his room, very few of which will ever need to go through the official justice system, most of which need to go through the prevailing system that's already there. But that prevailing system was not set up to deal with loggers. It was not set up to deal with tourism operators. It was set up to deal with its own sets of problems. So as these development challenges unfold, as they intensify, as the stakes get higher, using international agencies as a way to create a space for the negotiation of those solutions has been essentially what the Justice for the Poor program has been about. Thank you very much.